Power isn't measured by the number of people who fear your name. It's measured by the one person who isn't afraid to say no. I used to believe every street in Manhattan bent to my will. Every deal happened because I allowed it. Every silence existed because I demanded it. That illusion lasted exactly 4 seconds on a cold October evening, when a blind girl stepped directly in front of my motorcade and brought $20 million worth of armored vehicles to a complete stop with nothing more than a white cane and a voice that refused to tremble. Rain tapped softly against the windshield as our convoy rolled through Midtown just after 7:30 p.m. The city glowed beneath reflections of traffic lights and glass towers, each block moving exactly as my security team had planned. My driver never exceeded the speed limit. He never had to. People recognized the convoy long before they recognized me. Black SUVs carried their own language in this city. Doors stayed closed. Conversations stopped. Sidewalks somehow became wider. Fear had a rhythm, and I had lived inside it for so long that I no longer noticed it. I sat in the rear seat reviewing documents that would decide the future of 3 companies before sunrise. Numbers, contracts, signatures. Everything had a price. Everything except time. Then the brakes engaged. Not violently. Smoothly. Deliberately. The sudden stillness felt stranger than motion. My head lifted before anyone spoke. Roadblock? I asked quietly. My security chief pressed a finger to his earpiece while studying the cameras. Negative, boss. His voice carried something unfamiliar. Confusion. Then why aren't we moving? Before he could answer, I looked through the rain-speckled glass and saw her. She stood in the middle of Fifth Avenue beneath a flickering crosswalk signal, wearing a light beige coat that looked too thin for the weather. Her white cane swept carefully across the pavement, as if she were mapping an invisible world no one else could see. She wasn't looking at us because she couldn't. Yet somehow she faced the lead SUV with more certainty than executives faced boardrooms. Around her, pedestrians hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. Drivers leaned on their horns. She never flinched. One of my men opened the lead vehicle's door. Another stepped onto the wet pavement. They approached with practiced confidence, the kind earned from years of protecting men like me. I watched them exchange a few quiet words with her. Instead of stepping aside, she tilted her head slightly and smiled with heartbreaking politeness. Then she gently shook her head. My security chief frowned. She refuses to move. I almost laughed. Nobody refused us. Not politicians. Not billionaires. Certainly not a young woman standing alone in the rain. Curiosity replaced irritation. I opened my door before anyone could stop me. Cool air wrapped around me as polished shoes met wet pavement. Umbrellas appeared instantly over my head, but I barely noticed them. My attention stayed on the girl whose world contained no idea who I was. She heard my footsteps and turned toward the sound. "Excuse me," she said warmly, mistaking me for an ordinary passerby. "Could you please help me?" A little boy ran into the street after his balloon, and everyone else seems too busy to notice. I can't leave until I know he's safe. For the first time in years, nobody around me was watching my face. They were watching hers. Nobody answered her immediately. My men were waiting for me instead of listening to the only person on that street who was speaking with genuine urgency. The rain continued to fall in soft waves across the pavement, and somewhere above us a traffic light clicked through another cycle that nobody obeyed. The city had paused around a woman who could not even see it. I studied her face for another moment. She looked no older than 24. Light brown hair rested against the collar of her coat, damp from the weather, and her hand remained firmly wrapped around the handle of her white cane. There was no panic in her expression, no fear, only determination. "What is your name?" I asked. She smiled toward the sound of my voice. "Grace," she answered as if introductions were perfectly normal in the middle of a blocked avenue. "Grace Carter." Then she extended her hand toward me. "I am sorry if I caused trouble. I just cannot leave until someone tells me that little boy is safe." I looked down at her outstretched hand. It had probably been years since anyone had offered me a handshake without already knowing exactly who I was. Most people reached for my approval. Others reached for my money. She reached because that was what polite people did. Slowly, I took her hand. Her grip was warm despite the cold evening. She smiled a little wider. "Thank you. You sound calm." I was hoping someone calm would stop. One of my security officers stepped closer. "Boss, we already have another route. We should keep moving." Grace tilted her head slightly. Boss? She repeated. Oh, are you in charge of the drivers? I almost smiled. Something like that. She nodded thoughtfully. Then you can help even faster. Before I could answer, a child's frightened voice echoed from somewhere beyond the parked cars. Mister, I cannot get him down. Grace immediately turned toward the sound. That is him. Her entire posture changed. She took one careful step forward before stopping herself. He climbed somewhere high trying to catch his balloon. I heard people shouting a minute ago. I followed the direction of the voice and finally saw the boy standing on the steps outside a closed bookstore, staring helplessly at a bright red balloon tangled in the low branches of a decorative maple tree. He looked more embarrassed than frightened, but Grace had no way of knowing that. She only had the sounds around her. Stay exactly where you are, I called. The little boy looked toward me and nodded. One of my men instinctively started forward. I raised my hand slightly. No. Every eye turned toward me. Without another word, I walked across the wet sidewalk myself. The balloon hung barely 8 feet above the ground. I reached up, pulled the string free from the branch, and handed it back to the boy. His face lit up brighter than the city skyline. Thank you, mister. He hurried toward Grace. I got it. She laughed with pure relief, kneeling carefully until he wrapped his small arms around her shoulders. I told you not to run into traffic, she whispered gently. Balloons can be replaced. You cannot. I stood a few feet away listening to words no one had ever spoken to me when I was young. They sounded impossibly simple. Yet somehow they carried more weight than every negotiation waiting inside the folder I had left on the seat of my vehicle. Grace remained kneeling until she was certain the little boy had calmed down. She brushed a few drops of rain from his jacket with the same gentle care someone might use for their own child. Promise me something, she said softly. The next time your balloon flies away, you let it go. The boy sighed. But it was my favorite. She smiled. You were somebody's favorite too. That matters more. His mother hurried across the sidewalk a moment later, apologizing over and over as she wrapped him in a grateful embrace. She thanked me first because she could see who had returned the balloon. Then she thanked Grace because she understood who had protected her son. Within seconds they disappeared into the evening crowd, leaving the two of us standing beneath the rain while my convoy continued waiting in complete silence. Grace turned toward me again. I guess I interrupted your evening more than I realized. You did, I answered honestly. She lowered her head for a second. Then I am sorry. There was no calculation behind her apology. She was not trying to impress me or avoid consequences. She simply believed that inconvenience deserved kindness. That alone made her different from almost everyone I had met during the past 15 years. But, she continued, lifting her chin again, I would probably do it again. My security chief released a quiet breath that sounded almost like disbelief. I found myself asking the question before I had fully considered it. Why? Grace lightly rested both hands on the handle of her cane. Because schedules can be changed. Meetings can be moved. A child who feels alone in the middle of traffic cannot. Her words settled over the street more heavily than the rain. Behind me, nobody spoke. They all waited for my reaction because they expected the version of me they knew. The man who never accepted delays. The man who expected every minute to serve a purpose. Grace had unknowingly challenged every one of those rules without raising her voice. You still do not know who I am, I said. She laughed quietly. No, I only know what your voice sounds like. She paused before adding, people usually tell me titles before they tell me their names. I have learned that titles are not very useful. I looked at her for a long moment. She had no idea she was speaking to a man newspapers described with words like powerful, dangerous, untouchable, although they never printed my name beside those descriptions. She only heard another human being standing nearby. Nothing more, nothing less. Then what is useful? I asked. How someone treats people who cannot offer anything in return. She answered so quickly that it was obvious she had carried that belief for years. That tells me almost everything. I felt something unfamiliar settle inside my chest. Not guilt, not pride, something quieter. The uncomfortable awareness that she had measured me without ever seeing my face. My driver cleared his throat carefully. Sir, we are already 23 minutes behind. Grace immediately stepped backward, creating space for the convoy. Then you should not let me keep you any longer. She smiled again, completely unaware that she had already changed the direction of my entire evening. As she turned to leave, Tapping her cane gently across the sidewalk, I realized something that should have been impossible. For the first time in years, I no longer cared about the meeting I was about to miss. I cared about whether I would ever hear that calm, fearless voice again. The convoy pulled away, but I never opened the folder waiting beside me. Numbers blurred together. Contracts that had seemed urgent less than half an hour earlier now felt strangely insignificant. Outside, Manhattan continued moving with its usual precision. Yellow cabs slipped through intersections. Steam drifted from subway grates. Office towers reflected thousands of lights across rain-soaked streets. Everything looked exactly the same. Only I had changed. My security chief finally broke the silence. "Sir, should I reschedule tomorrow's meeting instead?" I looked up from the untouched papers. "Tomorrow." He nodded cautiously. "The board members have already been informed that you will arrive late tonight." I closed the folder. "Cancel tonight." His eyes widened for a fraction of a second before discipline returned. "Cancel completely?" "Yes." Nobody questioned the order, but I could feel every pair of eyes inside the vehicle quietly searching for an explanation that would never come. During 15 years of building my reputation, I had never canceled an important meeting for any reason that was not absolutely unavoidable. Yet somehow a conversation with a woman who had never even seen my face outweighed millions of dollars in negotiations. The realization should have bothered me. Instead, it felt strangely peaceful. We arrived at my penthouse overlooking the Hudson River just before 9 o'clock. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed an ocean of lights stretching across the skyline, but I barely noticed the view that had once impressed every guest who entered my home. I loosened my tie, poured a glass of sparkling water, and stood silently while the city hummed below. Grace's voice refused to leave my thoughts. How someone treats people who cannot offer anything in return. I repeated those words several times without meaning to. I had built an empire by measuring loyalty, influence, leverage, and opportunity. She measured people with an entirely different standard. My phone vibrated. Anthony, my oldest advisor, appeared on the screen. "You worried half the city tonight," he said with a quiet laugh after I answered. "People thought something serious had happened." Something did happen. There was a brief silence. Should I know about it? I walked toward the window. "Tell me something, Anthony. When was the last time somebody spoke to me without asking for permission first?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I honestly cannot remember." Neither could I. That answer stayed with me after the call ended. Around 10 o'clock, I stepped into my private office. Shelves filled with leather-bound books lined one wall. Family photographs occupied almost none. My desk remained perfectly organized because disorder had never been acceptable in my world. I pressed a single button beside the computer monitor. Within seconds, Daniel, the head of my intelligence team, answered through the secure line. "Good evening, sir. I need information." "On whom?" I hesitated for only a moment. "Grace Carter." His fingers immediately began typing on the other end. "Do you have an address?" "No." "Occupation?" "No." "Age?" "Mid-20s, I think." Daniel sounded almost amused. "That is less information than you usually provide." "She is blind," I said quietly. "And she helped a little boy find his way home in the middle of rush hour." The keyboard stopped. "Is she a threat?" I looked out across the city again, remembering the warmth of her handshake and the certainty in her voice. "No," I answered. "I think she might be the first honest person I have met in a very long time." "Understood. I will begin immediately." As the call ended, I realized I was not searching for an enemy, a competitor, or a witness. For the first time in years, I was searching for someone simply because I wanted to understand the kind of person who could stand in front of my entire world without ever seeing the power everyone else feared. Daniel called at exactly 8:15 the next morning. He had never been late with information, and today was no exception. I stood alone on the balcony outside my office, coffee growing cold in my hand while the first sunlight reflected across the Hudson River. "I found her," he said. There was something unusual in his voice. Not hesitation. Curiosity. Grace Carter, 24 years old. She teaches piano and introductory music classes at the Manhattan Community Center for Children with Disabilities 3 afternoons a week. Every Saturday morning, she volunteers at a reading program for visually impaired adults. She rents a small apartment on the Upper West Side. No criminal record. No outstanding debt. No lawsuits. No social media beyond a page promoting free music workshops. I listened without interrupting. Anything else? Papers shifted quietly. She receives disability assistance, but donates part of it every month to a neighborhood food pantry. I frowned. She gives away money she needs herself? Apparently, she believes someone else always needs it more. I looked out over the city, remembering the confidence in her smile as she stood in front of my convoy without the slightest idea who I was. Daniel continued. There is one more thing. Go on. Everyone we interviewed described her the same way. They said she remembers every voice she hears. She knows people by the sound of their footsteps. She refuses special treatment unless it is absolutely necessary. After the call ended, I remained standing there much longer than I intended. Over the years, I had ordered countless investigations. Politicians, investors, competitors. Every report eventually revealed hidden motives or carefully protected secrets. Grace's file contained nothing except ordinary kindness repeated in different forms. That was somehow more unsettling than any mystery. 2 days later, I found myself parked a block away from the community center shortly before 3 o'clock. I had no appointment, no strategy. I simply wanted to see whether the woman from the rainy evening had truly been exactly as Daniel described. The building itself was modest, with faded brick walls and a blue entrance awning that had clearly survived many New York winters. Parents waited outside, while children laughed somewhere inside the hallways. There were no luxury cars, no security gates, no polished marble floors. Only ordinary life unfolding without performance. I watched through the front windows as Grace sat beside an old, upright piano. 6 children surrounded her in a loose circle. One little girl struggled to find the correct notes, pressing the wrong keys again and again. I expected Grace to correct her immediately. Instead, she smiled. Do you know what mistakes sound like? She asked. The children shook their heads. They sound like somebody who has not quit yet. The room filled with soft laughter. The little girl tried again. This time the melody flowed almost perfectly. Grace clapped first. The others followed. No expensive speech. No dramatic lesson. Just patience. Just encouragement. I realized I had been standing there nearly 20 minutes without checking my phone once. My schedule had vanished from my thoughts. A black sedan pulled quietly beside mine. Anthony stepped out, looking more confused than concerned. You have canceled 2 meetings this week, he said after joining me on the sidewalk. Now I find you watching piano lessons. I smiled without taking my eyes off the window. Tell me honestly, what do you see? He looked inside for a few moments. A teacher. I slowly shook my head. No, I see someone who makes people feel more valuable than they believed they were 5 minutes earlier. Anthony studied me carefully before speaking again. That is not the kind of thing you usually notice. Neither was the quiet realization settling into my heart. Somehow, without asking for anything, Grace Carter had already begun teaching me lessons I had never learned while building an empire. 3 days passed before I finally spoke to Grace again. I told myself it was coincidence, although men like me did not believe in coincidence. Late Thursday afternoon, I walked into the community center carrying nothing except an umbrella folded beneath my arm. No security detail, no expensive suit jacket, just a charcoal sweater and dark slacks that allowed me to disappear into an ordinary crowd for the first time in years. The receptionist smiled politely. Can I help you? I heard there was a public piano class. She nodded. You are welcome to observe if you stay quiet. Quiet had never been difficult. Invisible was another matter. I found a seat near the back just as Grace finished helping a young boy count rhythm by tapping gently across the wooden piano lid. She recognized my footsteps before I said a single word. You came back, she said with an easy smile. Several parents looked toward me, assuming we already knew each other. You recognized me? I asked. She laughed softly. You walk with the same steady pace you had in the rain. Some voices fade. Yours does not. I had spent years making sure people remembered my name. Somehow she remembered something much simpler. The sound of my footsteps. After the lesson ended, children hurried toward waiting parents while Grace carefully organized sheets of music into neat folders. Thank you for helping that little boy the other night, she said without looking up. He came back yesterday and played me the happiest version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star that I have ever heard. I only returned a balloon. She shook her head. No, you returned his confidence. That sentence settled inside me with uncomfortable precision. We walked slowly toward the front entrance together. Rain had returned, softer this time, turning the sidewalks silver beneath the afternoon sky. I opened my umbrella instinctively. Grace tilted her face upward, listening to the steady rhythm of raindrops striking the fabric above us. "You always carry an umbrella?" she asked. "Usually someone else carries one for me." The words escaped before I considered how strange they sounded. She smiled. "That must be exhausting." I looked at her in surprise. "Having people do everything for you," she continued. "Sometimes kindness becomes another way of making people forget how capable they still are." I had never heard privilege described as loneliness before. We reached the corner where she normally waited for the audible crossing signal. A man wearing an expensive business coat approached with hurried footsteps. "Excuse me," he said warmly. "Miss Carter, I almost forgot." He placed an envelope into her hands. "The neighborhood collected donations to replace your old piano. There is enough money for a beautiful new one." Grace gently ran her fingers across the envelope before holding it back toward him. "Please thank everyone for thinking of me." "You are refusing?" he asked, genuinely confused. "The piano still works." "Barely. Then it still has music left." The man sighed. "You are the most stubborn woman in Manhattan." She laughed. "Only when someone else needs help more than I do." After he left, I finally asked the question that had been growing inside me since reading Daniel's report. "Why do you always refuse help?" Grace stood quietly for a moment before answering. "Because I have enough." She touched the edge of her cane. "I have a home. I have work that I love. I have children who remind me every day that hope sounds louder than fear. If I accept something I do not truly need, somebody else goes without it." I stared across the busy intersection as strangers hurried past carrying shopping bags worth more than an entire month of her rent. She possessed less than almost everyone around her, yet somehow believed she already had enough. In that moment, I understood why no amount of money, influence, or success had ever brought me the peace that seemed to follow Grace wherever she walked. The conversation should have ended at that intersection, but instead it quietly followed me through every hour that came after. A week later, I found myself returning to the community center without inventing another excuse. I no longer pretended it was coincidence. Grace was finishing another afternoon class when I arrived. Children surrounded her with the effortless trust that only children possess. One little boy proudly played an entire song without stopping once. The room erupted with applause, but Grace never took credit. "You practiced," she told him. "You did the hard part." I watched the boy leave carrying himself a little taller than when he had walked in. She had a gift for making people believe they were stronger than they imagined. After the last family departed, Grace gathered the music books into a canvas bag that looked almost as old as the piano itself. "You are becoming a familiar pair of footsteps," she said with a smile. "I hope that is not a bad thing." "Not yet." We stepped outside together into crisp autumn air. Leaves drifted slowly across the sidewalk, and somewhere nearby a street musician played a gentle jazz melody that blended into the sounds of the city. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course. If someone wanted to make your life easier, would you let them?" She laughed quietly. "That depends." "On what?" "Whether they are helping me or helping themselves feel better." Her answer landed with uncomfortable accuracy because I already knew which side I belonged to. Before I could respond, two men approached from the opposite direction. They wore matching jackets with the logo of a local building contractor. One carried a clipboard while the other smiled too quickly. "Miss Carter," one of them asked, "we are collecting final payments for the accessibility renovation in your apartment building." Management said everyone already agreed. Grace turned politely toward his voice. "I was not told about any payment. It was announced yesterday. $800. She hesitated. "I do not keep that much cash. We also accept checks." Something about the conversation felt wrong. Their voices carried confidence without sincerity. They kept interrupting each other with details that sounded rehearsed instead of remembered. Grace reached slowly toward her shoulder bag. "If this helps everyone." "Wait." The single word left my mouth before I realized I had spoken. Both men looked at me. I stepped closer. "Which management company hired you?" The first man answered immediately. "Riverside Property Group." "Interesting." I smiled faintly. "Because that building belongs to Lexington Residential Services." Their expressions changed almost at once. Not fear. Calculation. Without another word, they muttered an apology and hurried down the block, disappearing into the afternoon crowd much faster than they had arrived. Grace lowered her hand from her bag. "What just happened?" she asked. "Nothing that should have happened." She stood quietly for a moment before turning toward my voice. "You knew they were lying." "Yes." "Then thank you." I expected relief. Gratitude. Instead, she surprised me again. "But promise me something." "What?" "Do not spend your life assuming everyone needs to be rescued." I frowned slightly. "Why would you say that?" She smiled with the same calm honesty that had stopped my convoy days earlier. "Because sometimes protecting people means believing they can become wiser after one mistake, instead of making every decision for them." I looked at her in silence. Nobody had ever questioned the way I solved problems. In my world, control had always looked like kindness. Grace saw something different. She saw that even generosity could quietly become another way of taking away another person's dignity. And somehow that lesson was far more difficult to accept than any challenge I had ever faced in business. Grace's words stayed with me long after we walked in opposite directions that afternoon. Control had always been the language I understood best. If someone mattered to me, I solved the problem before they ever knew it existed. I removed obstacles. I opened doors. I made difficult decisions so nobody else had to. Grace believed dignity mattered more than convenience. I wanted to disagree with her. Instead, I found myself questioning every instinct that had built my life. 2 evenings later, Daniel called while I was finishing dinner with Anthony. "Sir, I think you should know something." His voice carried the same measured calm it always did, but I recognized the subtle warning beneath it. "Grace Carter stayed late at the community center tonight. She is walking home alone. And nothing dangerous. But one of our neighborhood contacts noticed the same 2 men from earlier watching the entrance across the street." I set my glass down. "Watching." "They left when another group came outside. They never approached her." Anthony quietly folded his napkin. "You were thinking about going yourself." I looked toward the window overlooking the city. "Yes." 20 minutes later, I parked a block away from Grace's apartment building. She had already reached the corner, tapping her cane gently across the sidewalk while humming the melody her students had practiced that afternoon. She seemed completely at peace, listening to the rhythm of traffic and distant conversations instead of seeing the lights surrounding her. I stayed several yards behind, careful not to interrupt. Halfway down the block, an elderly man struggled with a grocery cart whose front wheel had become wedged against the cracked curb. People walked around him without slowing down. Grace heard the frustration in his voice immediately. She stopped. "Sir, would you like me to call someone?" she asked. The man laughed kindly. "You are offering to help me?" "Of course." Before I could step forward, a teenage boy wearing headphones noticed the exchange, hurried over, and lifted the cart free. The older man thanked them both. Grace smiled. "See? Sometimes all people need is someone to notice." They continued on their separate ways while I remained standing beneath the streetlight, unexpectedly grateful that I had not interfered. She had been right. The world had solved the problem without my control. A few minutes later, she reached the entrance to her building. Just before opening the front door, she turned toward the sidewalk behind her. "You have been following me for almost 6 blocks, she said calmly. I stepped out of the shadows, surprised more than embarrassed. "How did you know?" She laughed softly. "Your footsteps slow down every time I stop walking. Besides, I recognize your silence now." I could not help smiling. "I wanted to make sure you arrived home safely." She rested one hand against the cool metal railing beside the entrance. "That is kind." Then she added gently, "But I hope you are also finding your own way home." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "You spend so much time watching over everyone else that I wonder if anyone has ever asked whether you are all right." The question caught me completely unprepared. Powerful men received reports, requests, and respect. We rarely received concern. I searched for an answer that never came. Grace smiled as though my silence had already told her everything. "Good night," she whispered before disappearing into the building. I stood alone on the quiet sidewalk long after the lobby door had closed, realizing that she had somehow become the first person in years to ask about the man behind the reputation instead of the reputation itself. The following Saturday, the community center hosted its annual neighborhood recital. Parents filled every folding chair. Children adjusted tiny bow ties and bright dresses behind the stage curtain, while volunteers hurried between classrooms carrying sheet music and bottled water. I arrived early and quietly took a seat in the last row, dressed simply enough that nobody looked twice at me. For the first time in years, I attended an event where nobody expected a speech, a signature, or a decision. They were all there for the music. Grace walked onto the small stage, carrying her white cane in one hand and a stack of music folders in the other. The applause that greeted her was warm, effortless, and completely genuine. She smiled toward the sound. "Tonight is not about perfect notes," she told the audience. "It is about brave hearts willing to play the first note at all." One by one the children performed. Some missed keys. Some lost the rhythm. Every time they looked nervous, Grace found a way to make them smile before they started again. Nobody laughed at mistakes because she had already taught everyone that courage deserved louder applause than perfection. Watching her, I understood something I had never learned inside boardrooms or private meetings. Real leadership did not make people feel smaller. It helped them discover they had always been enough. After the recital ended, families slowly drifted outside into the cool evening. Grace remained behind collecting forgotten music books. I walked toward the stage. "You stayed until everyone else left?" she said before I spoke. "I wanted to hear the ending." She laughed softly. "Every ending is just another beginning." I stepped onto the low platform and looked around the empty room. "Grace, there is something I never told you." She rested both hands on the top of her cane and waited without interruption. "The night we met, those vehicles belonged to me. The men waiting around us worked for me. I was not the driver. I was the man everyone moved aside for." She stood quietly for several seconds. I expected surprise, questions, maybe even disappointment. Instead, she smiled exactly the way she had on that rainy street. "I wondered," she admitted. "You wondered. People listened before you finished speaking. That usually means responsibility, one way or another." I let out a quiet breath. "Does it change anything?" She slowly shook her head. "No." "Why not?" Her answer came with the same peaceful certainty that had transformed every conversation we had shared. "Because the first thing I learned about you was not your position. It was the fact that you stopped to help a frightened little boy." I looked away for a moment, suddenly unable to find the words that usually came so easily. She reached forward carefully until her fingertips found my hand. Her touch was light, respectful, and completely free of hesitation. "People spend their lives trying to be seen," she whispered. "Sometimes they forget that being understood matters so much more." I closed my hand gently around hers, grateful beyond anything I could explain. Footsteps echoed near the entrance as Anthony and several members of my security team arrived to escort me to another meeting. They stopped the instant they saw us standing together. One of the younger men quietly asked, "Boss, are we ready to leave?" I looked at Grace, then back toward the men who had followed me for years expecting commands instead of lessons. Only one word felt honest enough to answer everything that had changed inside me. "Family." Silence settled across the room. No one questioned the meaning because they already understood it. From that day forward, the greatest victory of my life was never another contract or another achievement. It was the quiet miracle of meeting someone who could not see my power, yet somehow helped me finally see myself.